All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us again here on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon. This is Project Advisory Group meeting number 3 for the Clark County Housing Options Study and Action Plan. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, share the presentation for today. Off the bat, I'm going to apologize. I know everyone is anxious to dive into deeper and more robust conversations with each other, as a group. The format of this meeting is going to be similar to the first two, but I promise you that at our April meeting, we will start to have those more in-depth discussions, and we'll think about maybe using breakout groups or other techniques to and just providing more time for discussion than we're able to. But we've really, we heard from some of you, and we hopefully you value the information that we're bringing to kind of set the stage as we get started. So in just a minute, Jackie is going to share some announcements for this month or this meeting. And then I will just do a quick recap of the some key findings to date from the stakeholder interviews and from the data analysis presentation last month. Then Elizabeth Decker from Jet Planning is with us today, and she's going to walk us through the policy and regulatory review, which has several components, and hopefully you had a chance to go through those materials. Then we'll have a brief discussion towards the end of the meeting. We are about ready to start some broader engagement around this project and want to talk to you about different ideas that people might have about different types of engagement activities and what we think would be most beneficial at this point in time, and just really kind of pick your brains about some of the ways we might start to engage the broader community going forward. Then we'll do some public comment for whoever is on the line and wants to participate, and then wrap up with next steps. And with that, I will ask Jackie to go ahead with announcements.
Thank you, Steve. I just saw an email from Brian. Steve or Jenna, could you send him the public Zoom link, and then we'll bring him in? Thank you. Okay, so I just want to say thank you for all of your thoughtful responses from my check-in email that I sent a few weeks ago. I administer a lot of commissions, and I really enjoy getting to know the commission members and the people I work with. And through Zoom, it's very hard to do so. We don't get to chat prior to the meeting or on our way out, and that's just such another valuable piece, I think, of working together. So definitely keep sending any suggestions or comments or concerns that you have our way. We are happy to receive them, and they only make the project better and stronger. So just wanted to say that. And as Steve mentioned, some of the feedback had to do with, getting excited about having those deliberations and discussions. And we promise that we're getting there. We just want to make sure we get you all the information that we can to have those. Next, I just wanted to, again, touch base or remind about the open government training. I haven't received it from everybody, so if you haven't, please take a look at that. I'll add the link again in the chat there, and let me know if you have any issues accessing that. We also have had a couple local news articles about the project from the Columbian since our last meeting. So we've been archiving those, and I don't know, not everyone gets the Columbian, and there's always, if you don't, there's a limit on articles that you can read. So I'm going to work on PDFing them and posting them on the website. So you'll see a new section, and I'll share that with you when I have it up. And I'll direct you guys to it so you know where it is. That will keep those articles there, just sort of interest, and if you'd like to take a look at that. And then my last one is that We are getting ready to do our first kind of updates to our county council and planning commission, kind of get them up to speed as to where the project advisory group has been learning about so far. So those are scheduled. The county council work session for this update is going to be on April 7th at 10 a.m. That all of the meetings are open to the public. I believe for the council work sessions, it's a call-in number, so you can listen in. They don't do public comment during their work sessions, but you're more than welcome to listen in. The Planning Commission work session is scheduled for April 15th at 5:30. And again, that will be a similar to this, like a Zoom. It's our WebEx link where the public can join as an attendee, but there typically isn't any public comment. It's just us staff kind of giving them an update, a presentation on where the status of the project is so far, and hearing from them if whatever questions they may have or suggestions that we can forward on to you guys. So those are, I think that's everything I have. Jenna, did I leave anything out?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. That's all I have, Steve.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll move forward to just a few key findings from the stakeholder interviews and from the data analysis report from Echo Northwest last month. And this certainly isn't an all-inclusive list. We can refine these over time, but these are some things that stood out to us. So just a recap, remembering that what we're doing here is identifying challenges within the Vancouver UGA and really opportunities to encourage development of housing that is affordable to a variety of household incomes through the removal of regulatory barriers and or implementing other strategies. So just a reminder that that is kind of the key charge. And again, we conducted, I don't even remember the numbers anymore, of stakeholder interviews and some focus groups. And then just last month, we heard the data collection and analysis information from Echo Northwest. So some of the key things we heard in our stakeholder interviews regarding development trends and regulatory barriers, that recent construction does not reflect local needs. And I think that was largely seeing that the majority of homes being built, the large majority are single family detached dwellings, and that doesn't necessarily reflect what the residents of Clark County need or are looking for. Permitted residential uses and locations do not always support needed housing types. There's a lack of land supply for new housing, and a lot of the land that is available is encumbered. Lack of infrastructure is another barrier at times to development. Some of our stakeholders felt that the review and permitting process is fragmented and inefficient. Impact and development fees are not currently scaled to development. And the importance of working towards equity when reviewing policy and regulations to ensure that no group is disproportionately affected, for instance, manufactured home parks. So not really looking for much debate on these today. We're just trying to remind folks of some of the conversations and information that we presented earlier, building up to our presentation for today. Jackie, if you could take a look at the chat, there's a question there that I'll come back to you when I'm done with my with this piece of the presentation. So just some reminders from Echo Northwest's presentation that I think dovetail in part with the slide I just read for you. More than 50% of households in our study area make less than 120% of AMI. Many low-income households are renters. About half of renters are cost burdened in that area. The two graphs on the right show the types of units that are occupied today and how that compares to households. And we see that while many homes are 3 and 4 bedroom, many of the more than half of the households in our study area are 1 to 2 person households. 84% of people leave our study area by car for work. So just important to think about transportation and transit. And then most of the current housing stock is single family detached, 1,500 square feet and larger, and on 5,000 square foot lots or larger. So these are just a couple data points. I've got a few more. Most households are at 60% of AMI, or most households that are at 60% of AMI or below need to rent. New multifamily units rent at about 80% of MFI, or about $1,760 a month. And looking at the numbers, about 42% of households earn less than that amount. The median home sales price of housing is about $343,000. That equates to about 112 to 130% MFI. About 65% of households have incomes below this level. And then rents and home prices are increasing basically at a faster rate than wages are. And I have the number here somewhere for that, but I can't find it at the moment. So.
Oh, you want me to tell you?
Yeah, thanks.
Wages have gone up 12% in about the last 8 years, but rents have gone up like 20 to 30%, and home prices have gone up a staggering 95% per square foot of lot area. So some pretty significant increases that outpace wages.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I tried not to bombard you with more percentages and like specific data points. I wanted to give more just general statements, but I think those are just some important takeaways for us to think about as we move to the next presentation. Oh, I'm sorry. I did have one more slide. I put this one up just because there was a lot of conversation, I think, about this slide at the last meeting and what it says and what it doesn't say. And I think more than anything, the takeaway probably was, we know that we're looking more at more affordable housing types as our focus, going back to that purpose statement that I read at the beginning. But it's also important to acknowledge that it's important for these housing units to get built as well because of the impacts that it would have on the rest of the housing market if they didn't. So, but our focus is really more on the low to middle income housing. So with that, I just briefly introduced Elizabeth Decker of Jet Planning, and we're happy to have her on our team. And she has been spending the last few months doing a deep dive on Clark County and Washington State policy and regulatory review. And so with that, I will hand it over to you, Elizabeth.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve. And thank you all. I'm glad to be here with you. I've been following along in the project. I've been hearing great things about this group. So I'm looking forward to our discussion, and I'm told that, we'll just sort of feel free to jump in if you've got some questions, and we'll also have some time at the end to discuss what we're going to go over today. So some options there. As Steve mentioned, my background is in zoning and land use. I worked in Clark County for, not for the county, but in Clark County for various county jurisdictions for, about 5-7 years. Used to have my office in downtown Vancouver. So very familiar with some of the background there. And then I've been spending the last couple of years really working on housing policies, particularly zoning strategies for middle housing and other types of housing. So taking a more regional look with that. So I'm excited to combine on this project some of my county background with these, specific housing concepts, and thinking about ways that we can combine that and bring that to the county, and just, looking forward to working with this group. So if you would please, Steve. Okay, so we're at meeting 3, but we're talking about task 4, which is a policy and regulatory review designed to give us an idea of both what's happening locally, as well as what's happening around the state and around the region. So locally, we really dialed in on the land use policies, the zoning and regulations that impact development. So that included the comprehensive plans, some supporting plans, the implementing maps and the zoning code, And I think that you had a preview of some of those last month. So, we'll talk about what those mean. And then we also wanted to, inform that with a look across the state using some case studies. So we prioritize 3 jurisdictions that have done some work on expanding housing opportunities in jurisdictions that have some similarities and of course some differences to Clark County. So we use the city of Olympia, the city of Spokane, and then Spokane County to have another county example. And we'll talk a little about what we learned from them and, are there some ideas that might resonate here in terms of what's possible. And then we also wanted to, understand what we may be required to do in terms of changes at the state level. So we included an overview of recent state legislation that affects housing and housing policies, focused in on the last 2 years, the 2019 and 2020 sessions. And then, kind of a little bit of a preview of the current session, trying to guess which way the political winds are blowing. So that certainly has changed like week to week as we've been writing these drafts, and, even our current draft might be out of date by now, but just trying to get, give you a sense of both what the requirements might be coming out of Olympia, but also, like what are the issues, what are the opportunities that seem most ripe, that maybe are an inspiration for the county or something that seems like a good policy idea that we could piggyback onto. Okay, so we want to sort of combine all those together, and we thought we'd start locally by diving into the audit findings. So as I always like to say about zoning code and about all the different elements of planning, any individual piece is not going to be a Superman, right? A lot of times I'm coming into a project to, help make changes to the zoning code. Here it's the Unified Development Code. And that's never going to be the one piece that's going to, instantly transform the housing market. And you all come from a variety of backgrounds and engage with the housing market and housing options in the county differently. So I'm sure you're well aware of this. So instead, I like to think of planning as more like the X-Men, a whole team of superheroes working together to blend their skills and talents to help us achieve a more just and housed world. So that led us in this audit to include long-range plans, as well as the maps and development code that help implement those plans. Like good planners, we went back to the basics. We started with a community framework plan that informs the comprehensive plan and sets the long-range 20-year vision. And then we looked at some specialty plans, if you will, that are incorporated by reference into the comp plan, including the Highway 99 subarea plan. We did look at that aging readiness and growing healthier plans, which are, sort of a unique lens to look at all the different aspects of planning through the needs of, of an increasingly older population, that we're expecting in the coming years, as well as a lens of like, what does health mean from a community perspective? And I would say that both those plans, I summarized in the report. I'm just going to touch on them here to say, they add a new lens to how we can think about housing, and they very much support this idea of more housing variety to meet the needs of much broader segments of the community, as well as, thinking of housing not just as, a housing unit cut off from the rest of the community, but integrated into the community as a way to support health. So I think that we get a lot of strong support there. I think that we can look to things like the zoning map and the development code for some more specific ideas about how we implement that and make that happen. So next, if you would. So the B list, the superheroes that didn't make the cut, so to speak, that we did not include in this code audit. We needed to focus on some of the pieces that we thought were the biggest priorities and opportunities with this project. So there were a number of things that we thought, certainly are complex. We recognize that these affect development, but we also, it was really beyond the scope of this to get into. And also for some of these, we felt like there maybe wasn't very much room to make very many opportunities to make changes with this project, just due to the variety of state or local regulations that impact them. So we did not spend a lot of time looking at critical area regulations, SEPA regulations, although you hear there's you'll hear there's a few changes at the state level that we might have some opportunities there. Looking at, all the public improvement requirements, how wide your street has to be, what size street, sewer pipes need to be installed. All of that is, as came up in those stakeholder interviews, immensely important in terms of the cost of development and how feasible it is to develop a certain parcel. But, that is an entire another audit in and of itself. And is driven by a lot of engineering and regulatory requirements that are just beyond really our planning scope. So we note it here that it certainly impacts it, and if there are particular opportunities that we see come up, we can certainly come back to some of these pieces as we're shaping our opportunities to increase opportunities and decrease barriers in our housing option and action plan going forward. Same thing I would say about impact fees, very complex methodology, absolutely impacts the price of housing, but is perhaps beyond the scope of this project to do, full impact fee study. So we'll acknowledge it. And if there are particular opportunities or need for more information, even that arises, we'll certainly be sure to include that going forward. Same thing, there's other tax and financial policies, how you use your, real estate excise taxes, local sales taxes, that kind of thing. There are some new opportunities from the state, but pretty minor and, might be more on the recommendation side rather than, a full-on financial audit that would be supported. Also just acknowledge there are pieces of the building code, fire code, of course, that influence how things are built. And that's beyond our scope today. And then, in terms of sort of like a performance audit, like how many days does this permit sit on this desk and does the right person review it? And what's your, average email response time in terms of the permit processing? That is not something that we got into here. Although, certainly as you see in the stakeholder interviews, there, might be some concerns here, and that might be another thing to look at as we move forward in terms of opportunities. So next. What we did want to do, in looking at those long range plans and implementing maps and development code, is to really take like what I call a descriptive and an evaluative approach. So, first off, just let's understand what these plans and regulations address and what they require. And then let's say, take a more, critical lens and look at it from an evaluative, and for this project, an explorative lens. What does that mean in terms of the impacts of these regulations? And what does it mean in terms of opportunities for change? Are there areas where the regulations might be missing, a key opportunity, say, to provide more variety of housing? Is that implemented already by the plans and regulations, or could there be opportunities for change there? Of course, key planning tenet is looking at consistency between all these plans and regulations. If there were big discrepancies, that would be a concern, obviously. And then, since the way this whole task is structured is looking at how do we compare in the county, across the state to how other cities and counties are doing it, as well as, what we're hearing from the legislature. And then, to a degree, and this is a little bit more anecdotal rather than something we can quantify, but we want to start thinking through how do these plans and regulations impact development outcomes? So for all my years working on zoning code, I do not have a magic tool that says, if you require this, it will change the cost of a home by X, increasing lot size by 500 square feet results in this many dollars. And so that's why we have our great partners like Eco Northwest on the team. And we are going to be doing some feasibility testing around this to start thinking about changing some of those parameters and how that might influence prices. But for the purposes of the audit, we're sort of thinking more generally in terms of, well, we generally see that if you allow these many housing options, you're not going to be able to build these other housing types because they're not permitted. So we're just thinking about how what we see on paper relates to what we're seeing built on the ground, or not being built on the ground, as the case may be. So go ahead. And then something I've probably already said 10 times today, and you will hear me say it, 50 more, is middle housing. And if you're not familiar with this term, just want to make sure we're all on the same page. It's also sometimes called missing middle housing because, it just has not been built for a long time when we start talking about, what is not being built on, what's missing from our communities. So middle housing is generally, as it's been, talked about in planning circles, talks about alternatives to single family detached on one end of this graphic, and multi-unit apartment buildings on the other end of the graphic. And so in between, in the middle, there are some opportunities in terms of density and scale and the size of the units, to provide things like accessory dwelling units, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, cottage clusters, and courtyard apartments. And the idea, particularly on the lower end of this spectrum, is that the scale and form of these can be compatible with single family housing, and that they are best located in and can also support creation of neighborhoods that are more walkable, because you've got more community, more households that are, able to activate different kinds of transportation and are demanding, a coffee shop on the corner and those kind of amenities. So when we hear, if you hear me talking about middle housing, if you see it referenced, this is what we're talking about. And it's just easier than saying duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, cottage clusters, which I can also do. And it's a fun tongue twister, but just as shorthand. Next. All right, so long range planning policies. I think the good news here in terms of looking at the community framework plan that then implements the comprehensive plan is that, overall the county has a pretty strong vision for a variety of housing. And, it sets us up pretty well to provide those options implemented through the zoning and development code. So the community framework plan kind of kicked us off in 1993. And it's got this key policy about having, ensuring that that no single housing type exceeds 75% of new dwelling units. And so it technically could be any housing type, but it has always been understood to mean single family detached units. So what that means is that the remaining 25% of units, the goal is to get those to be something other than single family detached, so that it gets us towards this goal of more housing variety. And we can certainly be thinking through our project if there are strategies, if we want to tailor more towards the 75%, or if the 75, or I'm sorry, I said that wrong. If we want to target more towards that diversity in the 25%. There's nothing saying that the county can't exceed 25%. It's just that's what they're aiming for as a minimum. The framework plan also talks about transportation, public facilities, and housing, which are pieces we've talked about, and making sure those are coordinated so that investments are mutually supporting. Great, good planning policy. Talks about the need for infill development. So, filling in some of the lots that have been skipped over. That's also going to help with that better coordinated transportation and public facilities planning. And then, make sure to recognize that there are some households that have particular needs in terms of, senior households, households with people experiencing disabilities, and intergenerational households that also may have senior citizens. Go ahead. And then that framework plan literally forms the framework for the comprehensive plan. And how this affects our housing is the land use element sets out a pretty strong policy, or a pretty strong direction for the residential designations and what types of housing can be developed within those. So it's looking at a range of density with the creatively named low, medium, and high designations. And within those, the housing policies of this plan are really prioritizing a diversity of type and density and location and affordability of housing. And similar policies about public facilities, transportation, parks, schools. And as I said, the community framework plan and the comp plan together really give us a pretty strong policy direction about providing this variety of housing. So I think that where we might look for some changes here is depending on what kinds of, the scope of changes that we look at in the zoning code, the development UDC, the code there, there might need to be some fine tuning to these policies around density ranges and types of housing within these different ranges. But overall, the vision for a variety of housing really sets us up for these broader themes that we've been talking about. So next. And then we have sort of a fun, unique plan here. So as I understand, there's really like 12 sub areas within our study area, the Vancouver UGA. And this Highway 99 sub area has its own plan. So this is approximately 1/12 of the area that is covered by this. It's 2,400 acres. This was done back in 2008 through 2010, I believe, is when the code gets adopted. So it's really a unique approach that is not done anywhere else in the UGA, and affects a substantial, but not by no means all of the county. And it's looking at how to organize land uses around this particular geographic area where I-205 and I-5 come together. That's dominated by the commercial corridor along old Highway 99 before the interstate system was invented. And it's looking at a mix of commercial, residential, mixed use areas for our purposes. It's got 3 different residential areas: multifamily, mixed residential, and single family. So those more or less line up with that low, the high, medium, and low density designations from the comp plan. And it is generally supporting the kinds of things that we're talking about in this project, with a mix of housing types, as well as acknowledging that a lot of this is going to be infill, because the area has been pretty well developed. Go ahead. And what is particularly unique about this plan is that it's implemented through what they call a hybrid form-based code. And these, gosh, I love being a planner, but we have our sins, right? And a hybrid form-based code is a particular sort of way of saying that we're going to add a whole bunch of regulations on top of your existing regulations. And we're going to call it a hybrid, but it's really just extra regulations. That's the long and the short of it. And a form-based code is that means that it is trying to address more the form of building rather than the use that goes on within it. But this is where the word hybrid comes in, and it's not just Highway 99, it's most hybrid form-based codes. There's this urge to go towards the form-based, and then oftentimes it's difficult to really let go of those use-based regulations for jurisdictions. And so that's where it really just sort of gets layered on top of each other a lot of times. So, in this case, it's sort of meant to be an alternative to traditional zoning, and it is in part. It's definitely looking at it from a new lens, but in terms of how it's implemented, it really winds up being more of a mix of the existing code as well as this code. And so in some cases you get, 2 layers of zoning for some types of homes. So like single family detached residential, in the existing zoning code and in the low density zones, has some dimensional standards. And then this code within the Highway 99 sub area adds on some requirements about, where the front facade of the house has to be relative to the garage, and how it has to relate to the street, and the entrances and eyes on the street, those kinds of pieces. So in some places it adds standards. That's probably most in more like the multifamily residential, as well as the commercial areas, less so in some of these residential. In other parts of the Highway 99 code, it completely defaults to the existing code. So it is truly a hybrid. For example, cottage clusters in Highway 99, the section in this hybrid form-based code just says, see Clark County Code. So there's a lot of complexity just in, not to be nitpicky, but just the form of it. It's a 100-page PDF that's an appendix to the development code. It's not integrated in terms of like code sections and usability and cross-referenced. So it certainly adds complexity. And possibly one opportunity or outcome that comes out of this is trying to better understand that overall impact. One, how is it, I think the thing to look at is how is it affecting the quantity of housing that can be produced. You know, is this a barrier to development, or, you know, is it really just something else that everyone's, you know, found a way to deal with? And how is it affecting the quality of development? You know, the whole point was to provide a higher level of development that is better integrated and creates, you know, better places and better forms and better neighborhoods. And so, you know, it's been in effect for about 10 years, and I'd be curious to see, you know, what that really is looking like on the ground, and, you know, if there's added value that's coming through here. But so those are some of the things that stood out to me. Go ahead. Now, a little cheat sheet for you all before we get even heavier into the zoning code and the development code. When we're talking about low density zones in Clark County, that's the R1 districts. And those are, you know, 20, 10, all these numbers. And those are generally named for the minimum lot size. So an R120 means that the minimum lot size is 20,000 square feet. And then the medium and high density zones are the R zones. And those are generally named for the maximum density that's permitted. So an R43 zone means you could do 43 units per acre, which is basically 1 unit per 1,000 square feet. So different naming conventions. Higher numbers mean less density for the R1 and more density in the medium and high density. So I'll try to avoid talking too specifically and too many acronyms, but, you know, here's the cheat sheet. Feel free to refer back to it as needed. Go ahead. So we started off by looking at the map, right, which is the way that we geographically take the policies from the comprehensive plan and like literally apply them on the ground. So those 3 comprehensive plan designations for low, medium, and high get implemented by a whopping 15 different residential zoning districts. So we see that across the map. And within the county, and well, specific within the Vancouver UGA in our study area, residential acres predominate. So within, on the left, you'll see that everything not residential is 34%. So we're left with 66% of the county's land in the VUGA is zoned for residential. But within that, you'll see it is predominantly low density. So 59% of all acres within the Vancouver UGA are zoned for low density residential. So not only is, you know, residential taking up most of, you know, the real estate, so to speak, in our study area, it's also taking up, it also constitutes the majority of the residential buildable land. So that's the area that has been identified through the vacant buildable lands model as being either, you know, empty and suitable for development, or, you know, with such small scale existing development that is ripe for redevelopment. So within that, you'll see that 84% of the land is in that urban low density. So, you know, that's literally where the acres are and the opportunities are for building new housing. So when we think about our strategies, you know, there certainly are medium and high density opportunities, but we, you know, need to be thinking about how on the ground, this is, you know, sort of our canvas, if you will. We have the most acres available in low density designations. Okay. And then with sort of an abstract zoning map, if you will. But generally speaking, the yellows, right, are residential. This is the secret zoning code. This is another cheat sheet. Yellows are for residential, and the darker the tone, right, the closer it gets to orange, the higher the density. Red is commercial, and then purples and blues are industrial and mixed use. So what you see, right, is an awful lot of yellow. And then the higher density areas are generally concentrated, so that's the oranges, and the darker yellows are generally concentrated along the key corridors and nodes. And so, you know, what the strength, I think, of the county zoning map is that the zones are pretty well distributed in terms of being located near commercial corridors or other transportation routes. You don't see, you know, as many isolated pockets of high density residential or, you know, very small, you know, spot zoning, if you will, you know, of individual parcels that might be isolated from other zones. So does create pretty large chunks of zoning, which means, that there's some opportunity for gradations perhaps within there. So go ahead.
Elizabeth,
Yes.
I just wanted to just make clear for our audience here that also we're within that the urban growth area, but that darker orange that's like out in the rural area
Yes.
is agricultural zoning. So it's kind of
Thank
some of them, the colors are similar. But I
Yeah.
just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. Yeah, I had to double check that. So I was like, wait, why did we put all the high density out there? Great. Okay. And then next. Okay. So within those zones, right, once we've painted our color, gotten our crayon box out, colored in the map, and we're ready to put the crayons away, we are going to, one of the most fundamental questions that the development code is going to answer is what types of housing can be built where? And so this table, summarizes what different housing types are permitted, which require additional review, but are permitted with additional review, and which are prohibited. And so the zones are arranged in lowest to highest density, and then the housing types are sort of from lowest intensity to highest intensity. And so what we would expect, if you had more of the trend that we would be expecting across this table is sort of a diagonal green sweep through the middle with red on both ends, which is in fact, what we see more or less. So what we see is that, the lower intensity single family detached is permitted in the lower density zones. And then the higher density multifamily is permitted in the medium and high density zones. A couple of things that stand out that we might do some more work on to consider is the single family detached. Because it's a review use in the medium density zones, that means that, what we're hearing anecdotally is that a lot of new projects are being built with small lot single family detached, which does meet the density standards, but there's a very limited slice of the pie that's medium density residential. So there's a lot of pressure on that limited land supply to do both this single family detached on small lots, but that leaves less room for some of these other, middle housing and perhaps even lower density multifamily options. So, we could be thinking with this project, does that make sense to keep single family detached in some of those areas? We've got accessory dwelling units permitted with single family detached everywhere, which is great. Zero lot line, not necessarily the most popular option, but it is available in some of the low density and medium density. It's sort of a townhouse light is how I think of it. And then townhouses, we'll talk a little bit more about the minimum lot sizes and density standards, but it's certainly a start that these are permitted as review uses everywhere, but some of the dimensional and density standards mean that it can be difficult to develop them at their full potential. At the same time, townhouses are definitely the most dominant form of middle housing across the county. So certainly there are many projects that are finding a way forward successfully to provide this housing option. Duplexes, opportunities are somewhat limited there. So you see that the several low density zones don't permit them at all. There's a couple zones where they are permitted, the R16 and the R15. The lot sizes make it pretty difficult to do, and they're also only allowed on corner lots. So, it's a mixed bag there. And then cottage housing has been permitted, something that the county's been experimenting with. It's being permitted in several of the low density and medium density zones. And I understand, anecdotally, it's been pretty popular because of the density increases that it allows. So I think it's worth looking there about, like what about it specifically is working? Could it be expanded to some of the other zones? And are there particular pressures that maybe are being channeled through the cottage housing path simply because there are no other options? And could we make sure that the range of options is pretty good? As we talked about with equity, we want to make sure that manufactured home parks that traditionally, attract lower income households continue to be a permitted use. And then multifamily, of course, at those higher densities, we would look to see in the medium and the high density zones. So that makes sense. And then the last piece to point out with multifamily and what's missing from this chart in terms of that spectrum of middle housing is that there aren't a lot of opportunities for the lower intensity multifamily. So things like triplexes, quadplexes, say a 12-unit courtyard apartment that's just 1 or 2 stories. All of those are technically under the multifamily umbrella right now, and they're permitted in the medium and high density zones. But there's a one-size-fits-all set of development and design standards that apply to them that probably make it more difficult to do those small multifamily projects and drive, those larger several acre, up to 100 or more unit type projects. So there could be some opportunities to add those into this table as we go forward. So next, all right. So then when we, sort of take both that table and then think about the yellow areas on the map, some of the takeaways for the low density zones, first of all, it's just that it, geographically predominates. So, we've got our biggest opportunities there in some ways, but that most of the development is predominantly single family detached. So, that certainly is and will continue to be an important part of the housing supply in Clark County. But we want to think about what makes sense within those neighborhoods. Are there additional opportunities? And right now there's, relatively low densities, even in the R15, which is the highest density of the low densities. You can get to 8.7 units an acre with these 5,000 square foot lots. But, that together, some of these lot sizes and densities really limit the number and variety and, ultimately the affordability of homes that can be developed. And I think that we'll see the densities, particularly if we start talking about adding middle housing in, we'll need to think of a new way to think about density, right? Because say you permit a duplex on every lot that's the same size as a single family. Well, technically on that lot, your density has just doubled. Well, I mean, has the character of the entire zone changed overnight? Is it double the intensity? Probably not. But, we need to just think about what does it mean in terms of adding these middle housing and how do we use density and minimum lot sizes, as well as other form-based tools to make housing compatible, but also, make it possible to develop. And right now that density is really an obstacle, or would be an obstacle to developing greater variety of middle housing. But then as you'll see on the next slide, the lot development standards in terms of the setback and the height and the lot coverage allow for more than ample building envelopes. You can get pretty sufficient amount of building area on these lots, so we're not seeing a lot of concerns in terms of those dimensional standards. And what that also tells us is there's probably enough room within these building envelopes that if we were to take more of a form-based approach and say, here is the maximum building envelope you can do based on the setbacks and the height, and however many units you divide it up to in the, inside, there could be some additional flexibility there so that, a duplex might be fit within the same footprint that's already permitted in these zones compared to, just restricting it to a single family detached. Okay. And as we move to the medium density zones, as we saw in that table of uses, there's definitely a greater variety of housing. But here we start running up against those limits of the current density, particularly where some of the lot sizes, the minimum lot sizes for some of the particularly townhouses, the lot sizes are less than the maximum density that's permitted. And so the only way to really reach those minimum lot sizes if you have a mix of units in a project, and some larger lots and some smaller lots. And again, we are trying to create variety, so there's some value there, but depending on the site, there may or may not be enough room to balance those out. So we also just want to think about scaling those so that you can get the full potential of the densities that you're planning for and allowing, particularly as we start thinking about what adding some of these middle housing types would be. And as I mentioned, and as we saw in those pie charts, there's limited land supply available in these zones. And so right now, because single family detached is permitted on small lots, it could be crowding out some of these options for other middle housing. So we want to think about doing opportunities to provide, small lot, single family, what's the best use of this land base? Okay. And so, the theme that, that we're hearing is that a missing opportunity in these low and medium density zones is more of these middle housing opportunities. So if we're looking at how we could create those opportunities, right now the density standards and minimum lot sizes are really going to be an obstacle to siting those. And so we need to think of a different approach to density, whether that's using more form-based tools or just, increasing the density or providing for some averaging. There's some different, we'll get to solutions, but that's sort of where we need to apply our creative thinking. To say, one of the things that stood out positively in the audit is that there have been some changes to the ADU and cottage housing standards that the county has has moved forward. And I think those have, generally enhanced development opportunities for there. There's probably, a few more options for improvements there. We got some direction from the state legislature about removing owner occupancy requirements for ADUs, for example. So that's definitely something to look at. And then, as I mentioned, the middle housing opportunities and the triplex, quadplex, and, courtyard apartments that maybe are like 5 to 12 units, a small project, right now aren't explicitly permitted. So they're going to be pretty difficult to develop under the current set of regulations. And we could, there could be an opportunity to add those in more explicitly. So next. And then, when we get to the high density zones and you've got your more traditional multifamily, that certainly, is an area where we would be looking to get pretty big bang for the buck, right? You can get hundreds of housing units this way, which is a much more direct path than trying to get, say, 100 ADUs built. So although it's an extremely limited land supply, I think that it's still very much worth our time to investigate barriers and opportunities here, because the payoff potentially could be so high in terms of the number of housing units that could be created. So right now, the code allows densities of 30 to 43 units per acre, as I'd mentioned earlier. But some of those development opportunities, based on our very, very precise mathematical modeling here, are constrained by some of the competing site demands, right? Which I think, probably anyone that's tried to develop a multifamily project is well aware of, that, you've got this land area, you're allowed to cover up, to have a building footprint, of up to half of the site. But parking, this is an R30 site. If you were to build 30 units, which, per acre, which is the allowed maximum density, parking at 1.5 spaces per unit, takes up, nearly half of the site if you did it all as surface parking. And, yes, there might be some opportunities for tuck under parking, but I think, something like underground parking is probably not going to be market feasible in most of this area. So we generally see surface parking across the Vancouver UGA. And so trying to find a place to put it on the site, is a real site constraint. There's also requirements for required recreation space, that sound pretty reasonable at, I think I'm going to say 200 square feet per unit. But, again, once you start adding it up and trying to cite that as well as the parking in the building, you can see that it just doesn't quite all fit on a site. And there's, further complications, when you start getting into stormwater requirements, or if you had, critical areas with environmental constraints on this site. So there could be some opportunities here to look at how things could better fit to maximize, to help projects actually get towards those maximum densities that are permitted. Go ahead. So that's sort of our wrap up of, big picture, what we learned from Clark County's code and plans. And then as we look around the state in terms of case studies, if you would, to get some inspiration. As I mentioned, we looked at the city of Olympia, which actually tried twice to get their middle housing code implemented. They the first efforts that they passed in 2017 got hung up on a SEPA appeal, which is, a cautionary tale in and of itself. But they, are still working on that appeal, but in the meantime decided to work on a more targeted set of code updates that were passed at the end of last year. So we were able to review both of their two initiatives. We also looked at the city of Spokane that passed a package of updates and has been working on housing updates, a variety of strategies for, the last 6-7 years. And then Spokane County, we also took a look at the work that they've been doing last year or two. They passed some changes to better support housing as well. So, to summarize, and I'm happy to talk about in any more details, but I think what we wanted to take a look at is that most of these efforts, all of them included a comprehensive plan update to adjust some of those policies and to better create options and direction for the code updates. For Olympia in particular, that wound up being pretty important to make sure that they had that consistency between what the comp plan was requiring and what the code was implementing to support the proposed code. That was one of the issues that came up on their SEPA appeal, unfortunately. So, that just underscores that we want to make sure that we have a strong foundation in the comprehensive plan. Code updates, we saw both Olympia and the city of Spokane made changes there. And then Spokane County did both code updates as well as changing the map. And so that was looking at some upzoning in particular. So to get some more medium and high density zones, and they were really using more of a corridors and nodes strategy to make sure that the higher density was along those transportation corridors, which already lines up pretty well with the way that the zoning districts in Clark County in our study area are distributed. So a vote of confidence for that distribution of zones, and could also point to maybe we take another look, see if there's any other corridors that could benefit from that. But just a confirmation that might be a good direction to go. And, I like, it's missing no more, right? Missing middle housing options are, were a key part of all of the strategies in these 3 cities. And so, we see that there's opportunity seen to expand these middle housing choices. All 3 cities all 3 jurisdictions worked on that. Olympia and the county said, well, maybe we make some changes to the zoning map, but we can also make some changes about what's already permitted in the zones as they are. So they increased some of the density permitted within those zones. And then city of Spokane took that same approach to the medium density zones, increasing the density there rather than, upzoning or changing the color on the map. So, a few other takeaways here, just that, what's missing here in terms of initiatives is that there weren't a lot of financial pieces or incentives that were prioritized as part of these packages. So things like changes to impact fees or SDCs, changing permit fees, perhaps these, jurisdictions are going to do that as a further implementation step, but they didn't stand out as priorities in their recent initiatives. The importance of getting your comp plan to point towards where you want to go with your development code was something that we heard in all jurisdictions. Just procedurally, for Olympia, certainly the SEPA exemptions and some changes to the rules wound up being pretty important because of some technical issues they ran into. We can talk a little bit about, in the legislative summary, but, some of the changes to the SEPA legislation, unfortunately, only cities are eligible to use. And Clark County is in a little bit of an unusual position, being a county with an urbanized area. And so some of those exemptions, unfortunately, don't apply, but there are a few opportunities that we can take. And then the last piece, and I'm perhaps violating this tenet, right? When we've got these strategies about increasing density in the low and medium density zones. But just that messaging and outreach can be very important in shaping this. And so, just thinking about the differences between framing this project as, housing options and housing opportunities versus, say, calling it something like housing densification. That is clearly not the name of this project. And we don't want it to be. We really want to focus on where are those opportunities and those options, and where is it we're trying to get. We're not trying to get to some abstract number on paper, where we're just measuring units per acres. We're looking at what is the actual housing like, what is the form like, what are the households, and how do we meet the needs of all of our county residents. Those are the priority issues, and the more that we can, these jurisdictions found, the more that they can keep them central to their messaging can be really important, particularly if there can, be some misinformation that comes out. Sometimes there are some, activist groups that, seize on particular aspects of the project and disseminate particular messages or statistics that may or not capture the full content of the project. So the more that this project, and can get ahead of that by providing a fuller range of information. So hopefully, some of these articles in the paper and these meetings that we're holding and updates to Planning Commission and City Council or County Council can also help us with some of the messaging here. So next, please.
Elizabeth, we have a question in the chat.
Great.
Would you like to hold it till I know you're getting close to the end. Do you want to hold it, or should I ask it now? Or can you see it?
Let me see. This looks like it's a case study specific question, so
Yeah.
I'll hopefully do that. Okay, were any of the three jurisdictions faced with density and lot size incongruence, or are they a model of how Clark County should address its issue here? I think the short answer is that all of them had to rethink how they dealt with density, right? Because they all introduced middle housing options. And so when you start introducing middle housing on similar lot sizes, the density metric then does no longer really matches with the number of units you're permitting on a lot size. So I can't comment on the specific ways that they solved that, other than, some places, you can kind of change the numbers, say, now you allow double the density. Another model is just to get rid of density, right? And all you regulate is minimum lot sizes and allowed housing types. And we're not gonna, measure necessarily what the end result is. And then another approach is to offer targeted density exceptions. So the cottage housing code that Clark County already has, right, says right up front that you can do double the density in order to do cottage housing. And so some of these jurisdictions used, those similar targeted density changes to say, well, for duplexes, you can do double the density. Inherently, that's what it, essentially a duplex is if you put it on the same size lot. So those are a few of the models that we saw. All right, legislative summary, if you would. So we also wanted to, check in and see what is it that, what direction are we getting from the state level, both in terms of, are there big mandates or requirements that the county is going to need to respond to and come into compliance with? But also, is there interesting policy development? Are there, concepts and ideas that are being developed that could be, of interest and could create opportunities locally? So I think the biggest finding is what the Washington legislature hasn't done, right? So unlike some other West Coast jurisdictions and across the country, the Washington legislature has not passed a middle housing mandate for cities and potentially counties as well. And instead, they've really been focused on, a range of incentives to encourage middle housing, but not necessarily require it. The mandates that have been coming out of Olympia have been much more targeted. So they're much, smaller things like, there are that if you have, you know, an affordable housing project within a quarter mile of transit, you must change your, you know, your off-street parking ratios to not exceed a certain number. So much narrower than, you know, a broader mandate to say permit duplexes in all single family homes. They've really been leaning hard on, you know, incentives and opportunities. There's been this idea that, you know, we'll provide a menu of options, and if jurisdictions want to do them, you know, perhaps they get some grant funding or they get some different tax, you know, tax dollars from the state. But that's really been the direction so far. Instead, you know, the range of policies and requirements that we're seeing in the past couple of years, and even in this session, have to do with, you know, fundraising and tax exemptions. There's, you know, some changes to how you can use the real estate excise tax, as well as, you know, ways to encourage those new forms of housing rather than requiring them. You know, the legislature does seem to be looking more broadly, not just at zoning and permissions, but also understanding how things like, you know, tax rates and SEPA requirements impact housing feasibility. So, you know, that is interesting to see because we didn't see that as much at the case study local level. And then, you know, as I mentioned, Clark County is in sort of an unusual position for this urbanized area that's developed at densities, you know, at or above densities of many cities. But a lot of the legislation specifically coming from Olympia is targeted at cities rather than counties. So, you know, in some cases, that means that the county has more flexibility, right? If a new requirement only applies to cities, well, then counties don't necessarily have to comply, but we could use it as, you know, inspiration or as a policy idea that to consider. And in other cases, you know, it sort of means that counties can be left out. So things like some of these SEPA exemptions, where if you took certain land use, made certain land use changes by you know, a stated deadline. So things like introducing duplexes or triplexes or upzoning near transit, that those actions could be exempt from SEPA appeal. But unfortunately, you know, that didn't extend to the county. So sort of a mix of, you know, well, you don't have to do these things, but also you don't get to do these other things. And, you know, rumor has it that at the state level, they're working more on creating parity between cities and counties in this session. So, you know, we'll see where that goes. The legislative summary has more detail about precisely what, you know, sort of relatively minor policy changes are coming out as mandates that affect the county. But I think, you know, the big picture is that they're fairly minor and pretty targeted at this point. And there isn't, you know, a firm county or a firm direction from the state as to how they think counties and cities should be tackling the housing situation. Although, you know, there's a lot of interest on housing and a very keen understanding that it is a concern and an issue across the state. All right, so that is what I've got. There is so much more detail on all three of these pieces. You know, I hope that some of the details in the materials were of interest to you, and I'm happy to answer questions or provide more detail about certain pieces. I think there's at least one other question that I missed in the chat, so if you want to go back to that, maybe.
I don't know that you missed a question. I mean, we're also want to hear comments and discussion as well. So maybe we'll start by opening it up and see if we have some questions or comments, and then go from there. All the zoning questions you ever wanted to ask, you can have the answers now. I don't know, Elizabeth, I guess you did such a thorough job.
Well, there's an awful lot of material.
So Elizabeth, do you know, I think you gave some of your findings from the audit. Are there any recommendations that are at the top of mind for you? I realize that wasn't part of the audit to make recommendations necessarily, but any that come to mind for you?
Yeah, I you know, certainly to tip my hand, right? I think that middle housing options in the low and medium zones are going to be a pretty big opportunity as part of this project to build on some of the existing things that are permitted. I'm interested to hear if there is, there's sort of two paths, right? In terms of, do you want to go down the path of allowing more housing options in the zones that we already have on the map? Or do you want to go down the path of changing the zones on the map so that it permits more housing, on more acres? And generally it seems like, more communities have chosen the first option, to just change what's permitted within areas. I think that helps psychologically. People are resistant to change, and the idea of, like my zoning district changing on a map can be more threatening sometimes. So that's certainly a big opportunity, but I also, wouldn't want to overlook some opportunities particularly around parking, to recalibrate parking for multifamily housing, to create some opportunities to better maximize, the relatively limited acres we have. I'm keenly aware of, the need for cars. I think you had shared that statistic about 84% of people in this study area are leaving the area by car for work. So that's going to continue to be a priority. We want to accommodate that. So it might be more targeted parking changes. So, some of these pieces, like I mentioned, we could build on the state changes about affordable housing, or housing that's near transit, or housing that's for specific populations, like people experiencing disabilities or older adults that have lower car ownership rates. So it could be more of a data-driven approach on those.
We do have a raised hand. I'll let you finish and then go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna let you finish. And then I guess the last piece is, I'm very curious to hear from the group and from the county about, are there opportunities, in Highway 99? How is it working? Is it adding value? Or, a lot of the changes that we might make to the underlying zones would carry over to Highway 99. So, that might be enough to address that sub area, or if there's additional changes that are needed to that code there. Not a full overhaul right at this point, but some targeted changes there for some of those single family and mixed residential areas. So big picture, that's what I'm seeing for zoning and policy.
Thank you. Mark, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Elizabeth, thank you for a great presentation. I appreciate your passion you have, especially around middle housing. I work with a group called Incremental Development Alliance that is a very focused effort you're familiar with out of the Congress for New Urbanism.
Yes.
And there are just significant learning lessons being played out across the country. So I'm a little bit saddened but not surprised to see that our case studies are only Washington-based. I see the sensibility for that, because that's the operating arena we have, but that shouldn't preclude us taking a look at other alternatives that have been played out in other jurisdictions. Just given your experience, where have been some pretty premier examples of folks taking a look at this from a middle housing standpoint that really warrant our attention?
Yeah, well, just, in terms of the case studies, right? We only had 3 and we had to make, the most of it. So, that's sort of what led us to Washington jurisdictions. But yes, I appreciate the bigger picture thinking. Of course, Minneapolis, that allows triplexes where all single family homes were previously permitted, comes to mind. But of course, it's also worth noting that in their first year of implementation, anyone want to guess how many triplex permits they got? It's the answer is 3, which is funny because it's a triplex, but yeah, they got 3 in their first year, which I don't think says, is a final, not verdict, that's the word I'm looking for, a final judgment of how effective those changes might be. Certainly, I think any of these changes we make will likely have, small incremental effects that, as you say, the Incremental Development Alliance, but that magnify over time. I'm somewhat avoiding your question, but I would invite, all of us as this group to come together and share some of those other examples from places. Of course, we have to mention, Oregon, that's in the midst of implementing their middle housing mandate for all cities of 10,000 or more, this year and within the next year as well. I've been involved in a lot of the details of that. I think that, yeah, I could talk for a whole nother hour about that. There's some interesting parts about it. I think it has become very narrowly focused on some things, and codified to within an inch of its life, which is both helpful and, maybe cuts off some opportunities at the same time, but that's what happens. The most inspirational options. Like St. Petersburg, Florida has done some interesting work, actually. I got to do some work for, yeah, I guess I would say AARP nationally really supports middle housing work. And so I get to do some policy work with them, sort of virtually flying into different cities across the state or across the country. And so it was interesting to look at Florida. Austin did a pretty interesting project. I wish California were a better example right now. They have some limited examples, but they've not seen a lot of statewide action on this. And they have some very clear needs in that state. So just keeping an eye on that. But yeah, I'll keep an eye out for other case studies. And
Elizabeth, I appreciate your Minneapolis triplex example. I think you could say both City of Vancouver and Clark County on their ADU policy have experienced a similar sort of scenario. And to me, the bottom line message in that you're going to look for some early adopters and really get some momentum going. You've got to do something to incentivize those opportunities. And so things like ADUs, and you think about the number of infill ADUs that we could do and how big of an impact that could have on our housing affordability issue. To do simple incentivizations along those lines, some are going to be a little bit of a challenge from a state policy standpoint, but tax abatement, those sort of things where people are devoting those properties to low-income residency, just makes total sense.
Yeah, there's also, like, in terms of incentives, some fun psychological tricks. I'm not an expert at this, but I've seen jurisdictions that say the first 100 ADU permits, we're waiving SDCs or something. So, get people rushing and excited. So, right. Or, permits in the next 2 years, something like that.
Go ahead, Ron.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of continue to build on the aspect of for us to get where we think we want to be. I think we're going to have to come in with a variety of tools and levers. And I don't think we're going to be able just to take one or two prioritized examples and make it work. I think the example of saying the ADUs, cottage housing, things of that nature, they should be filling a bigger niche, but they're not. And perhaps Jackie could bring forward some information of just about how much the county has actually been able to utilize this tool that's already in existence. And the other item, I guess, in that regard of just checking how we've been doing is how well has the Highway 99 sub area been doing towards getting the goals that we were hoping for in making those changes. Because I think that helps kind of inform the group on whether existing policy, when applied in an overlay fashion, is really adequate, or whether that is not enough. And then we would have to move towards what Mark is talking about in the idea of coming up with forms of incentives or policies. I do think the group is going to have to be forceful enough to be able to say straight up that some things we need to change. I think a 1993 framework policy probably needs to change. This isn't the kinds of problems that were looked at in 1993. If we say 25% is the goal, but we have 84% of the land in low density, we're already outside of the framework. And even if we shift another 9% into it, does it really meet our goal? And I guess that's the other thing that I'm really hoping for this group before we're all said and done. I really feel like we need to come up with some firm targets and goals, at least to have the public review and chew on, and to get our policymakers to be able to come out on in the form of they're with it or they're against it, and what is the reasoning behind it. What we saw recently just in the Columbian about losing some high density for low income people housing over there in the Five Corners area, Covington Road, I think not being willing to trade potential jobs and job creation zoning for the idea of high density. We have to really weigh this whole thing out in that regard, because what we said is we're not willing to house the people that are already working, but they're in a very tough situation of being in service industry or lower income jobs looking for housing. These are the same people that we want to be doing job creation for, but we're not willing to house them. So I think we have to have a clear understanding if we want people. A lot of the jobs that are going to be created in Clark County are going to be in the lower income strata. 2 people making minimum wage, that adds up to $30 an hour. That still only puts you at $60,000 roughly a year, full-time wages. And we saw the statistics about what you get for $60,000 a year for 2 wage earner family. So we should be targeting some strata that we really say we want to be helping out. And then I think this group will bring some weight, at least to the dialogue. I think it's going to be really important for us to be able to firmly say that there are some things that we feel are deficient enough that we need actual policy changes, which brings me back around to the framework thought process. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And one piece that I did not include in the presentation, but is in the audit, is there certainly has been this question about, should high density residential be permitted in commercial areas or mixed use areas? And I think that that's also tied up in, what kind of high density do we actually permit in the high density residential zones that are, 30 and 43 units an acre. And is that sufficient? Right now, some of the development standards don't even, make it difficult to even get to those levels. But, if there's a need for, even higher densities to support affordable housing projects or whatnot, is there a way to accommodate it in high density residential, or looking, further afield to integrate into some commercial or mixed use areas? So thanks for the reminder. Keep looking more broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. And at our next, and Elizabeth, and at our next meeting, we will move into some goal setting. Not being able to see the future, I don't know, certainly this group can influence what those goals look like, but that's part of the conversation we're going to have at our April meeting. Brian, I think you raised your hand.
Yeah, sorry for doing it. I can't find where it is on my screen here to actually raise it.
I think just so,
it's
if I may, well, I think for some people it's in the more tab. I don't know. It's different, maybe different for different people, but.
Okay, well, this seemed to work. So yeah, I'll be quick. So great presentation. That was great information and great follow-up discussion. I guess it would be useful, I think, to help to frame the problem a little bit, to have, we heard last week, I think it was some pretty good data on that there will be, I think it was through 2035 or whatever year, this many people that will need to be housed. And there was, I think, there was a number of units, how many units is that going to take? And so I think it would be really useful to know, even just on a very high level, how does that break down by income range, even if it's just 2 or 3 ranges, and associated land supply type. So in other words, it's not hard to say if there's whatever 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 people coming, we can anticipate this many would need subsidized housing of some kind. This many would need housing in a certain range, and we could tie that to this many people would need housing that is typically affordable only in the 3,000 to 4,000 square foot lot range. So from that, we can begin to get a sense of, even if it's really high level, of how does the land supply that's out there correlate to that? Do we need like a lot more of this type of housing or this type of zoning district, or maybe just a little bit more? I think that would help, even if it's really high level.
Thank you. That really helps set our direction. Those types of ideas help set our direction going forward. That's helpful. I was wondering if anyone on, okay. Hopefully people we got everyone covered between the Zoom raised hand and the real raised hand. I was just wondering if those in the development developers in the development world, or on the other side of the counter, if what Elizabeth presented resonates with your experience, and if there's any other, situations that you've encountered that you think we should be thinking about as we move forward that maybe Elizabeth didn't cover in the audit. That's just one question. Certainly other questions and comments welcome, but I know we have a lot of experience in this virtual room.
Yeah, this is Victor. So we have developed, we're under construction for a project in the Highway 99 overlay district right now. And some of the design requirements were a little bit, excessive for affordable housing. Like, I understand the intent, but when we have to operate under the state, they have limitations on how expensive affordable housing can build. So those extra design features just really eat into our bottom line on projects. And we can't increase our rents to get more, capital. So that's an issue. And then also we had to make a decision because some of the improvements needed along the street frontage were just a bit excessive as well. And I understand, like I said, I'm an urban planner by background, so I fully understand the intent of why we wanted these design features, but I just think there needs to be flexibility. And then as well as the parking, 1.5 for senior affordable housing, they aren't all driving cars at that rate. So it's just a bit also excessive, and it determined like how many units we could put on site. Like we could have put up to 60, but we scaled it to 40 because we needed to fit the appropriate amount of parking on the site. So just 2 examples.
Yeah, and that was one other thing that stood out in the parking standards to me in Clark County is that, not only are the numbers, the numbers aren't that different from a lot of other, similar jurisdictions in terms of minimum requirements, but there were very few exceptions. It's pretty common to see, affordable housing projects or projects for seniors or projects, within a distance to transit or smaller units or, just different ways to get exceptions for specific projects. And there are almost no exceptions. The parking code is very short, which is, maybe we should complicate it a bit. Thanks, Victor.
Yeah, thanks, Victor. Other experiences that people have had that either concur with some of what we've heard or maybe differ? We'll get to you in just a second, Mark. I just want to make sure others have a chance. Okay. Not seeing others. Go ahead, Mark.
Just quickly, I was going to add Elizabeth's presentation with the image there on high density development. That's kind of going to the question you brought, but there is going to be a session held on April 7th, hosted by the Incremental Development Alliance group called Visualizing Code. And I'll send you some information, Steve. Folks may be interested in going through that. It's going to be about a 3-hour session on Zoom. It is going to get right down to the nitty gritty about you have a zoning code and some building requirements. How does that pencil out? And that may be very helpful for folks that are really wondering, how does this play? How do you get a code to actually work and get the kind of results you're looking for? That's all I wanted to share.
Thank you, Mark. And I think that is what it's all about, right? Designing that code so we get the types of units that we're looking for. Any other comments? We do have one more agenda item before we get to public comment, but I want to make sure everyone who's had a chance to speak can do so now. Okay. Yep, we've got Sierra. Go ahead.
So this maybe touches a bit on what Brian had to say, and it touches a bit on what Victor had to say. It touches a bit on the B list that we're not going to talk about, which really was my favorite part of the list, and I think should be the A list, and the A list should be the B list. But I think it's worth considering on some of these things, whether we're talking about, a long-term goal of naturally occurring affordable housing, that we can maybe create with tweaking the zoning code. as well as very intentional affordable housing and subsidized housing. And I was thinking specifically of the example that Victor gave, and how that may tie into required public improvements and certain impact fees that are indeed maybe much more difficult to absorb for very low income housing than they might be for other projects. And so I do think it's worth talking about. They're both important components, but they're very different types of affordable housing. And I think we have to address them both, but maybe very separately and specifically.
Yeah, thank you. That is a really great clarification.
Thanks.
Thank you. Ron, why don't you go ahead and then we'll move on to our next item.
All right, thanks. Just building on what Cirque just said and the discussion I think earlier with Victor is, I think this gets us back to what I was saying a little bit earlier about, I think we're going to have to be fairly purposeful about what we're doing as far as targeting goes. And if we really want to talk about the idea of income base in the housing and what's affordable, then I think we can be pretty upfront about the aspect of what housing types we're supporting in what fashion, and not the idea of all density is necessarily created the same, or the county wouldn't be looking at it in all of the same way. Because obviously Victor isn't looking for return on investment margins, whereas other developments may very well need margins for return on development. So the concept, I think, of being able to cover everything with just a couple of ideas, I don't think is achievable. And if we water it down to the point that it's covering all bases, I think we'll be disappointed in the outcome. So I'm more inclined for us to be narrower in our targeting with what we're really going after, and then be more aggressive on what we're really willing to present. I think just from a standpoint of what Elizabeth showed, there's lots of opportunities in the concept of policy, and some of those will go on the B list. Thanks.
Thanks again. And at our next meeting and going forward, I think that's really what we're going to be working on, is starting with a bigger universe of possible strategies and starting to narrow those down and get to the real recommendations that meet our goals. And like I said, we'll look at some goal setting at our next meeting as well. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to move on to our next agenda item. I'm going to share my screen again, if I can find what I'm looking for. So someone mentioned earlier, having what we might bring out to the public for their review as well. And we have about the opportunity for, I'm going to say, approximately 6 types of larger outreach events that obviously were envisioned as something different than we might have to do due to the pandemic. And we'll see, how long our outreach lasts and how that dovetails with restrictions on, in-person events. But I wanted to take some time to talk to all of you about some ideas for what these events could be. And the public involvement plan that Jackie and Jenna put together listed a number of possible ideas about outreach activities and what those could look like. And I pasted a number of those here, ranging from traditional or now Zoom, workshops and open houses. Certainly we can do online meetings and questionnaires and interviews and things of that nature. But I also want to think about the potential we have for educating, maybe ourselves as well as the public in using these events to do that. Jackie and Jenna had listed informational videos about the project, so we could do videos, walking tours or driving tours that would help us understand the situation on the ground in certain parts of our study area. I don't know if there's speakers we could bring in who have a particular expertise that people are wondering about. So I just really wanted to take, and I'll, excuse me, I'll mention that I think one event that we know we're going to want to do, single one is kind of a kickoff virtual meeting where we'll be presenting some sort of subset of the information we presented to you over the last 3 weeks. So I think a kickoff type meeting is one thing we know we want to do, but I really wanted to just spend 5 or 10 minutes hearing from all of you and seeing if you have any ideas about how we can best use the resources we have in terms of reaching out to the public and or providing opportunities for education for the broader community, but also for ourselves. So I guess I'll open it up, and Christina, go ahead.
Well, I think these are all great options. Just speaking from someone who's been working with creating access to the vaccine for older adults, I would just ask that we have a variety, including the printed materials, for those who may not have access to the internet. So that would just be my request, is that we consider accessibility.
Thank you, Christina. And I know the public involvement plan also talked about making sure that people know they can request things in different languages as well. So we'll be thinking about all types of access, and especially, yeah, and like you said, using a variety of different tools or methods and activities in order to provide people with various opportunities to participate. That's the thing, we don't just want to do 6 Zoom meetings and 6 online surveys. That's not what we're shooting for here. So I just was hoping that others might have some ideas, either things you've participated in or seen, or ideas you have about whether it's for the public or for your own education, as we kind of take our next steps and start really talking about developing the different actions and strategies, if people have thoughts on what they think would be effective. Heidi, go ahead.
I really like the concept of the independent walking or driving tours of different housing types. A lot of people need to see something real, and what's around it, how does it interact with what's next to it. So I appreciate that. I remember in Portland, they used to have green building tours, and you'd get to go to all these different kinds of houses and ADUs and all kinds of other stuff, and get ideas that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Thanks, Heidi. Are there any, and this is for anyone, are there any specific locations within our study area that we think tells an important story about some of the challenges that we're facing? Whether it's, I don't know, access to transit, or yeah, I don't know, it could be anything. I'm just wondering if people have any areas in mind where they say, wow, people should really go see this, because that shows some of the issues that we're trying to address. Well, I think we got some of that from our stakeholder interviews, so we can go back to those when we were talking, especially to the development community. But if anyone has any thoughts in that realm, we could certainly design a walking tour around specific areas. Other thoughts about public involvement or ways of engaging the community besides just a virtual meeting that we think would be effective? Victor, go ahead.
I was just curious, is there funding available to just incentivize folks to take the surveys, or, gift cards for grocery stores or gas cards or something like that? It's one of my thoughts, and the other thought was partnering with sort of culturally specific groups, so on NAACP or LULAC, if you're missing target audiences.
Thanks, Victor. And I think partnering is a great idea. And on the other, I think that's more of a Jackie question. On the other question about whether we do have some resources for things like incentives or gift cards for people to take online surveys or participate in focus groups, if we have any resources in that arena.
I'll have to look into that. So I'll circle back with the group and see what's possible. It's not something the county has done in the past. So, but it's a question I can ask.
Great. I know we've worked on several projects recently where stipends or even offering a drawing, being entered into a drawing for a gift card has helped out with turnout. There's a couple comments in the chat here about virtual tours of middle housing. And thanks, Mark, if you can send us those resources. More case studies from around the country of innovative approaches. So, that's maybe something we could do as well as, dedicate some of those funds to providing more information. We'll look at that. Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, I think in the past we've had some good results by doing some community preference work where we kind of show example A or example B and see what the community likes, even though perhaps the goal is accommodating the same way. It gives the people opportunities to feel like they're engaged in meeting the goal. It seemed like nobody else has gotten the phone interview that I got yesterday, but the way the questions were worded, I genuinely believe there's already some group that's interested in pushing back on the concept of quality of life versus density. And there's going to be, I think, a message that really comes out in regard to anything other than single family attached is going to have an adverse impact to your personal quality of life. And so I don't know who sponsored that, but just the way the wording of the questions was, it continually circled back around by, could you live with, and what was this like for you when you saw something? Basically trying to get more of an emotional response. So even though I am somewhat dissatisfied with the outcome, what we're really trying to get is a better outcome, right? So I think some idea on our part about what we hope the future is going to look like and on preferences, so we can talk about that middle housing in a positive fashion, and also talk about the idea of how it impacts the community when your neighbors are able to have more housing choices. I think we have to really think about this in the context of whether we are appealing to people or making them feel like this is just something being forced on them as well. They don't care about what the problem is. They only know what is in their own personal household or backyard at the moment.
Thank you. And we know the visuals of showing these housing types is really important. I also know from being a community engagement practitioner that visual preference surveys are very apt to bias. So you have to be we have to be really careful when crafting something like that to make sure we're not inadvertently putting our bias into those questions. But again, we do know that the visuals of how these housing types can look is really important to getting people to buy in. I'm wondering if there's anyone, Victor gave us some good ideas, others that work with particular constituencies, if there's particular activities or methods that have worked really well for you over the past year in engaging members of your constituent communities, or any other comments in general. Elizabeth, you may have seen, go ahead, Kate.
I just want to echo what Victor mentioned regarding not only culturally specific groups, but also groups that focus on just kind of specific areas or, some kind of a unifying collective. Fourth Plane Coalition comes to my mind. There's many others, my agency, for example. And engaging with those agencies because they know what works to engage their constituency. And so I think that's an effective way to move forward, especially if you want to make sure that you're engaging diverse populations.
Great. Thank you, Kate. We will definitely do that. I think working with partner organizations is going to be critical. Elizabeth, I don't know if you saw there was a request that I don't know if you came across, if you have any examples from your case studies, you don't need to share these now, but if there were any visual photos or site plans or other aspects of your case studies that you could share, that's another opportunity. Go ahead.
There are definitely there's a few links at the end of the case studies document that go to the project websites in those different communities. And, particularly the Olympia one has a lot of great visuals and, public handouts that are more geared at explaining the concepts. So I'll take a look at what's there. And if there's any, great options that we didn't already share, I'll put those together and email them to Jackie. And I just wanted to piggyback on this opportunity, in addition to these walking and driving tours, another thing that we wanted to encourage this group to do is if you have projects or photos of your projects in the county or, around the region that you would like to share, that would be really useful for us to be building sort of a photo library of regional examples so that we can make these presentations, both the public meetings as well as, even our discussions here a little more visual, but, targeted. My personal pet peeve is when we're talking about all this middle housing and we're using pictures of duplexes from 100 years ago, or a brick fourplex from, downtown Portland or something. Well, whatever, but that's not what we're going to see, and that's not the point of these things. So any recent project examples, we would love to feature your good work. So please do send those. And I just wanted to recognize that Phil with, oh God, I always say it wrong, GIN Development was able to get some great pictures to us that were useful in the audit. So, and would love to open that up to all of you. If you have pictures to share, we'd love to feature them. Thanks.
And thank you, Elizabeth. Well, if anyone thinks of other specific approaches that they think would be either effective in reaching the broader community or helpful in terms of maybe some information that hasn't been presented over the past few weeks that you would find helpful, you can let Jackie know. That would be great. Mark mentioned Orange Spot in Portland. Yep, we can reach out to them. A lot of good examples there. Okay. Then I'm going to move on to our public comment period and ask that folks see if any of our attendees have a comment they'd like to make. They can raise their hand, I'm pretty sure, and then I can allow them to talk to provide their comment or question. All right, we've got Glenn. I'm going to allow you to talk here, Glenn. So take a couple minutes for your question or comment. Thank you.
Hello, so I'm Glenn Young, and I live in Vancouver. I'm very appreciative that there's this group organized to take on this work. I didn't know it was in existence, and I'm sad that I didn't know it. I will be taking part as much as I possibly can in the future. So I am a small general contractor. I do remodels, and I have also I've built about 5 ADUs in the downtown area of Vancouver. So I have a lot of experience in that. So anybody that would like to ask me for questions on that offline, I'd be happy to speak with them to give them insight into that. There's a Facebook thread right now that I think this group would be really beneficial to look into. It's on a group, and I can provide that to whoever needs it to disseminate it, but it's got well over 100 comments about ADUs and the impacts and the issues around them. I think it would be good information for this group. I would love to see more advocacy for changing the state legislature liability laws on condos to see that we can get some more of those built. I think that is a really critical missing piece in the housing industry. So one of the things that I would love to see focus on too is to find paths to make it more reasonable for people to build their own homes. One of those things, including, ADUs, this is an idea that I had that the city or county can actually have engineered and architecturally drawn plans for ADUs and for small homes that people could save an enormous expense on building those. That would be very beneficial. One of the problems too that we deal with is very onerous permitting process. You know, in Vancouver, it is a challenge for those of us that are experienced in the industry, let alone somebody that just wants to build their own house. You know, when we're talking about really tiny houses, that is something that is feasible, that people can build their own house. But if they can't navigate the permit system, then where do we go from there? Also something I'd love to see, and this may have, I apologize, I didn't see here the first two meetings, so that some of this may be just repetitive for you. But I'd love to see more shared facilities, meaning, you know, some of the things like water mitigation and treatment and things like that. Some of the things that you've got to do on an individual lot basis right now, I'd love to see exceptions for that, to where you can put one system that services multiple locations, be much more efficient that way. I'd love to see, this is something I've thought about a lot recently, but I think that we really, especially when we're building affordable housing, we have got to at least lay the conduit infrastructure in for electric charging, wherever that parking may be. Because, you know, in the future, the near future here, when the only option that you have is to buy an electric vehicle and you need one, but an affordable unit doesn't have a place for a charger, that basically excludes you from the ability to live there. So I think it's really important that we look into the future on that. So let's see. And another big thing too is, how do we increase ownership? Not just housing options, but how do we get more people to take part in the wonderful opportunity of home ownership? You know, that is the best thing that can, I mean, it's just an amazing thing economically for people. And I'd love to see for more people to be able to benefit from that. You know, more creative ideas on ownership. That's partially why it comes down to condos too, rather than getting just all apartments that are owned by, you know, a handful of people. We can allow more people in that ownership opportunity. And one of the things too is I was curious about, and this is something I don't have any experience on, and I would love to hear more about, is when we do develop these creative new ideas, what sort of funding mechanisms are there? You know, we want to make sure that there are funding mechanisms for people to be able to participate on their own. I don't want to end up in a situation where all of these options are only available to the large developers that are able to package them correctly. I just want to have more opportunity for more people. And so that's something that we do need to look into, is how these things are funded, or can we get them so inexpensive that people are able to fund them in other creative ways? So I appreciate everybody on this group and your input and your time, and I look forward to some good discussion. And oh, one last thing, I apologize, I'm taking all the time here, but one thing I think we should really look at is letting the community buy into these changes. There's some things happening, some hyper local zoning, basically, that the county or the city come up with multiple different options that they can have and allow residents of neighborhoods or streets or blocks or however it's defined to actually vote and actually just, you know, decide on their own accord to join in on these zoning options. And that avoids that NIMBY, you know, attitude. I understand where that attitude comes from. It's a difficult thing to combat, but I think that if you allow the community to buy in themselves, you'll have a much more receptive response and a much more positive result. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Really appreciate those comments and the fact that you're following along. Jackie or Jenna, if you could post the website address into the chat. Glenn, we did record the 2 previous meetings and we're recording this one, so you can, you know, some quality watching to catch up on what you missed at those first 2 meetings. But thank you very much for your comments. Anyone else for public comment? Okay. I am going to move to our, oops, I should have provided that screen. Sorry about that. To our next steps. So just a reminder that of our general schedule here, we're today. We're extending a little bit into our April meeting, but most of what we're doing in terms of review and analysis, we're wrapping up right now and starting to move into this phase where we'll be developing recommendations and reaching out to engage the broader community in helping us develop these recommendations and refine them. Excuse me. In terms of specifics, I think Jackie mentioned these at the top, but we'll be presenting the same subset of the information we presented to all of you at County Council on April 7th, and then going to Planning Commission with the same information on April 15th. Feel free to tune in. Some of the topics for our next meeting on April 27th oops, are some pro formas that we're I thought I might have spelled that wrong, that we're going to be sharing with you. And we're still working out the details on those, but we'll have those ready in advance of the next meeting. Again, we'll revisit key findings from the stakeholder interviews, the data analysis, and then from Elizabeth's presentation today of the audit. And then we will begin this discussion of goals and starting with a larger universe of potential strategies so we can start narrowing those lists of strategies down to achieve the goals that we set for ourselves. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation next month. And then I know I sent out a calendar invite, but just looking ahead, the next meeting, we have meeting number 5 will be on May 25th. If there are no questions and comments, we're right at 5 o'clock on the nose. Jackie or Jenna, anything to add before we adjourn?
No, just thank you all for being here and listening and learning and sharing, and more to come.
Great. Thanks everyone for your time. We really appreciate it. Have a great evening and maybe get out and enjoy some sunlight. All right. Thank you.
Real quick question, if you can answer it.